Hey guys, Luke Ellis here with Rivera Capital. We're going to be talking about the dynamics of how an LOI works when you're trying to buy a business, or if you're the seller and selling your company and haven't been through this before. If anybody's unaware of what an LOI is, it's a letter of intent. Essentially, it's the way that we try to get a structure or a rough structure as best we can from the data we have on that company when before we go into closing. So there's a lot of really important points that go into an LOI, and I think the most important thing that I want everybody who sees this to know is that you want an LOI to be detailed enough that you hit all the key parts of the agreements that'll go into the purchase agreement eventually, but you don't want it to be too broad that it, or too, I fucked that up.
Yeah.
I'll restart.
Don't want it to be too expansive.
Yep. All right.
Okay. Take three.
Take three, yeah. Hey guys, Luke Ellis here with Rivera Capital. Today we're going to be talking about the dynamics of how an LOI works, and if anybody's unaware of what LOI means, it's a letter of intent. It's essentially the first step in making an offer on a company if you're looking to buy it, and if you've never sold your company before, I think this is incredibly relevant for you as well. So there's a lot of different steps that go into an LOI. First and foremost, one thing we like to notice is that you want your LOI to be detailed just enough that it covers all of the major topics that could blow a deal up as best you can, but keep it simplified and broad enough that you don't pigeonhole yourself or get caught on a term that later on changes once you get in and start doing diligence on the company. So there's three major components to how we try to price a deal or put together the price structure on a deal, one of which is going to be your cash at close. Pretty simple there, just what we'll pay the seller at the time of closing. The second part of that is we try to simplify this portion even where you can call it a seller note, but there's other ways you can also structure it, but it's basically the fixed compensation that's owed to that seller directly. And so that may be in the form of a note or some other kind of revenue split or something like that. And then the third component that goes into the pricing mechanism of the deal is the earnout, or the variable compensation as we call it. And that's essentially a pay for performance model. One of the drawbacks that I want to note with an earnout is that if, say hypothetically, a deal is $10 million, but $3 million of that is made up of earnout money, you essentially still have to pay taxes that year on that $10 million. And then amend backwards if, for example, you don't hit that total earnout and get the entire $3 million out of the deal. As you go back down the kind of through the steps of the LOI, the next important point that we really like to highlight and we think is one of the most important in any deal is net working capital. And essentially what this is the total capital left in the business in order for the new owner to take over for the first 30 to 60 days to keep everything operational. A lot of brokers or bankers out there will tell sellers, oh, you get all the cash, all the AR, all the inventory paid for. That is materially not factual, because if you think about it, when that owner started that company from zero, there was no payroll, there was no inventory, anything like that. So the working capital in the business was zero. But if it's a business doing $10 million a year in revenue, there's going to be a certain amount of money that has to be left in there to keep it operating until that new owner gets everything switched over and is continuing to generate that revenue on their own. We can walk through net working capital, and we'll do a very, very expansive video on that later, because it is something that seems to be the hardest for everybody to understand, and it took me quite a while to fully understand it and be accurate with how we approach it. The next piece that typically comes up is going to be around exclusivity during the closing process. And essentially, in most deals, we'll ask for 60 to 90 days of exclusivity where they can't talk to any other buyers through that process. And one key thing that we really, really want to note and make sure you do not do if you see this video is never put down an earnest deposit on an LOI. Usually it's attached to, or the broker or banker will say, well, in order for you to have exclusivity, we need you to put down $25, $50, $100,000, and hold it in earnest, essentially to keep the deal, for you to buy. We highly discourage this because it often leads to legal ramifications if the deal falls apart, or puts a lot of tension into the deal prior to even getting into closing and into due diligence. The next point that typically comes up is going to be around the non-compete and the seller transition. So, non-competes are going to be, really structured for the seller, so they don't go and open a competing business right away and take all the clientele that you just bought from them. One thing to note that we try to tell our clients and that I think is important is that a non-compete can be as lengthy as you want it to be. However, the courts in a lot of ways have said, hey, anything over about 5 years, unless there's some kind of extra compensation for that lengthier non-compete, is typically where you're going to run into that limit. And then you can specify geography, you can specify industry and or sub-industry, and get very detailed if you want to on how that non-compete looks. On the seller transition piece, that part, typically what we tell our clients is that the seller will provide 90 days of transition for free after closing, to help get all the systems transferred, make sure everything's running right, make sure that the new owner gets into whatever that prior owner was doing and learns it from them directly. If after that 90-day period, or if it's a more complex business where the owner needs to stay on longer, then we start to negotiate some compensation typically from there. But if you're paying somebody $10 million for a company, they can throw in 90 days worth of time to help transition it if they want to make sure it survives. The next point that typically comes up is going to be around real estate, and we'll get into this much more in depth as well in another video, because of how real estate prices have started to affect whether you can purchase or lease during that buying process. Typically what we recommend our clients to do is to structure a lease or lease to own, and then from there it can work out at a later date the purchase of the real estate from that prior owner, unless they're adamant about selling it up front. Another point that typically comes up is, and especially if you have a broker or banker who does not want to give exclusivity without a deposit, is setting certain benchmarks around closing. And what these would be is typically, 45 days or 60 days for due diligence, some limit on having some kind of term sheet and or commitment from a bank or a credit institution in order to fund the deal. And then obviously the closing date and when we expect that to occur. One thing to note here that I think is really important that's changed over the last couple years as interest rates have went up, and due to the overexposure I think a lot of commercial banks have in real estate, that credit has tightened tremendously. So even if you're doing an SBA loan, you could go to 10 different SBA lenders and you'll get 10 different answers. So it's not as unified as a lot of people make it seem. And so that's one of the areas we focus on right up front, is we start looking into the credit and finding a lender right away while we conduct due diligence, because it seems lately at least that the credit process has taken much longer than any other part of that closing process. Typically on a general scale, if everybody's working and responses are coming in reasonable amounts of time, typical closing timeline is going to be 60 to 90 days. And we've had deals that have closed in less than 30 days. We've had deals that took 6 months before the bank was ready to fund. It just depends on a lot of different factors there and what comes out of that deal. One point we'll hit on that I don't think is important for this video, but we'll get into some more internal dynamics around quality of earnings reports and if you should order those, or what type of accounting you should look at, and how much you should bring your accountant into a deal through that process, because it does matter as well as far as if you do an asset or a stock sale, and there's a fine balance that you should walk with that as far as the tax savings versus the legal risk of each of those. We'd be happy to talk through that with you if you're in the middle of a deal or thinking about writing an LOI. Feel free to email us or call us. And that's essentially the kind of nuts and bolts of it. One big thing that I do want to note that we really try to provide for our clients is that we prefer, if we structure the LOI and draft most of that for our clients, not only to save them money in attorney fees, but it also helps us get more in the weeds and get the client more actively involved than if they just bring their attorney in to draft it right off the bat. Let alone if you don't have a good M&A attorney, they may not know how to properly structure some of those terms in that LOI that can come back to bite you in the end when you're negotiating the purchase agreement later on in closing. If you have any other questions about LOIs or want to reach out and talk about how the closing process works, feel free to reach us, and thanks again for watching.